Home Alone 3, Here Comes the Cat, produced by John Hughes, written by Vladimir Vagin, illustrated by Frank Ash. Chapter 2, High Altitude Attitude. Page 1. The interior of Flight 422 smelled of stale pretzels, upholstery cleaner, and the collective anxiety of 300 people about to spend 11 hours in a pressurized tube. The McAllisters had successfully colonized the rear 5 rows of the economy cabin, turning the back of the Boeing 747 into a floating suburb of Chicago. Kevin was wedged into a window seat, his nose pressed against the cold glass. Below them, the lights of the Midwest were being swallowed by a thick, churning blanket of clouds. "Hey, look at the bright side, Kevin," Buzz said, dropping into the middle seat next to him with enough force to make the armrest groan. He was already tearing into a bag of extreme jalapeno peanuts. "If the engines freeze over the Atlantic, you'll be the first one to hit the water. You're light. You might skip once or twice before the sharks get you." "Shut up, Buzz," Kevin muttered, not taking his eyes off the window. "Make me trout sniffer." Buzz leaned back, his massive frame overflowing into Kevin's personal space. He reached into his carry-on and pulled out a small, handheld electronic device that looked suspiciously like a modified garage door opener. "Check this out. I called it the Silent Nightmare. Uncle Vlad's not the only one who can tinker with electronics." Kevin glanced at the device. It had a single red toggle and a directional antenna made out of a wire coat hanger. "What does it do?" "It's a signal jammer," Buzz whispered, a wicked glint in his eyes. "Whenever the flight attendants try to use the intercom to announce something boring, I press this, and it sounds like a cat being strangled by a vacuum cleaner. And," he leaned in closer, "it messes with the movie screens. Watch." Buzz pointed the coat hanger antenna toward the row in front of them, where Uncle Frank was trying to figure out how to plug his headphones into the armrest. Buzz flicked the switch. Across the cabin, 20 small seat-back screens flickered. The image of a column-travel documentary about the Hermitage Museum suddenly distorted into a chaotic mess of static and jagged purple lines. "Hey! My TV's busted!" Frank hollered, shaking his screen. "I'm paying for a ticket. I want to see the Russian gold." Buzz ducked his head, muffled snickers vibrating through his chest. "See? I'm gonna be the king of this flight. By the time we hit Moscow, everyone's gonna be so cranky they'll be ready to start a revolution." Kevin looked at the static on the screens. It looked strangely familiar. The purple jagged lines weren't just random interference. They were pulsing in a rhythmic pattern, almost like a heartbeat. He looked down at the DVD player bag under the seat in front of him. The silver remote inside was glowing again, the light bleeding through the fabric of the case. Page 2. Buzz's thumb hovered over the Silent Nightmare trigger like a detonator. He was watching a senior flight attendant, a no-nonsense woman named Brenda, wheeling a heavy beverage cart down the narrow aisle. She was currently balancing a tray of tomato juice and hot coffee, moving with the practiced grace of a mountain goat. "Watch this," Buzz hissed. "I'm gonna hit the frequency for the PA system right as she passes Uncle Frank. It'll make the speakers pop, she'll jump, and Frank gets a face full of V8. "Buzz, don't," Kevin warned, looking at the glowing bag at his feet. "Something's wrong with the remote. It's reacting to your jammer. The only thing reacting is gonna be Brenda," Buzz sneered. He jammed the button down. But the Silent Nightmare didn't emit a quiet signal. Instead, the wire coat hanger antenna began to glow a violent, neon violet. A sound like 1,000 screeching violins tore through the cabin, not from the PA system, but from Buzz's device itself. At that exact moment, the flight hit a pocket of severe clear air turbulence. The plane lurched violently to the left. Brenda, the flight attendant, gasped, her feet leaving the floor for a split second. The beverage cart, caught in the gravitational surge and the weird electromagnetic pulse from Buzz's jammer didn't just tip, it slid backward with terrifying speed. "Hands up!" Jeff yelled from 3 rows back. The tray of tomato juice launched into the air. Thanks to the weird purple static humming from Buzz's device, the liquid seemed to hang in the air for a second too long, defying gravity before drenching Uncle Frank and Aunt Leslie. "My eyes! I've been shot!" Frank bellowed, clutching his face as the thick red juice dripped from his forehead. But the real mishap was just beginning. The silent nightmare started smoking. Buzz, panicking, tried to toss it into the aisle, but the wire antenna got snagged on his velvet suit sleeve. "Get it off! It's hot! It's hot!" Buzz yelped, thrashing around in his seat. As he flailed, he accidentally kicked the seat in front of him, sending a full cup of ice water into the lap of a very large, very grumpy Russian man sitting in row 48. The man turned around, his eyebrows knitting together like 2 angry caterpillars. "Who is making the electricity sound?" The man growled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated Kevin's window. Kevin looked down. The silver remote in his bag was now strobing in sync with Buzz's failing jammer. The "Here comes the cat!" DVD case was vibrating so hard it was rattling against the floor bolts. "It wasn't him!" Kevin shouted over the chaos, pointing at Buzz. "It was a solar flare!" Page 3. "A solar flare?" the Russian man repeated, his eyes narrowing as he wiped ice water from his thick wool trousers. "In the middle of the night? Over the Atlantic? They happen!" Kevin squeaked, trying to shove the vibrating DVD case further under the seat with his heels. The cabin lights flickered from white to a sickly, supernatural violet. Up in the cockpit, the pilots were likely staring at a compass spinning like a ballerina, but in the cabin, Brenda, the flight attendant, was marching toward row 49. Her hair was slightly disheveled from the cart incident, and she looked like a woman who had run out of patience 3 time zones ago. "I need everyone to remain calm," Brenda announced, her voice strained. "But we are experiencing significant electronic interference. If anyone has a cellular phone, a radio, or a—" she paused, sniffing the air, "a smoldering coat hanger, they need to surrender it immediately." Buzz turned the color of a New York radish. The silent nightmare was no longer just smoking. It was emitting a smell like burnt hair and cheap capacitors. With a panicked look, he realized he couldn't just drop it. The antenna was still hooked into the threading of his fancy velvet sleeve. "Buzz, give it to her," Kevin hissed. "No way. This cost me $40 and a pack of firecrackers," Buzz whispered back. In a moment of pure panic, logic, Buzz looked around for a hiding spot. His eyes landed on the seat pocket in front of him, which was currently stuffed with Uncle Frank's travel pillow and a half-eaten ham sandwich. Instead of using that, Buzz reached over and jammed the sparking device into Fuller's open backpack, right next to a giant bottle of Pepsi. "Hey!" Fuller chirped, waking up from a sugar nap. "Is it time for the movie? My backpack is glowing. It's a night light, Fuller. Keep it quiet or no refills," Buzz threatened. The interference reached a crescendo. The silver remote in Kevin's bag let out a low-frequency hum that made everyone's fillings ache. Suddenly, the silent nightmare in Fuller's bag short-circuited one last time. A bright blue spark leaped from the antenna, arcing across the aisle and hitting the PA system's input jack. Instead of a flight attendant's voice, the entire plane's audio system erupted with a distorted, slowed-down recording of the Christmas carolers from Chapter 1. "A-fe la 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 la, la 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 la." The speakers groaned, the voices sounding like they were being broadcast from the bottom of a well. "What is that?" Aunt Leslie cried, clutching her tomato juice-stained blouse. "Is the plane singing at us?" Page 4. The distorted caroler audio wasn't just singing. because of the silent nightmares. Strange frequency, it had picked up the audio Kevin's Polaroid camera had captured just before they left Chicago. "Get off my camera! Wet bandits escape! Laundry exchange!" The speakers blared, the voices of the news report from the driveway mingling with the ghostly F.A.L.A.L.A.s. Kevin froze. The secret was literally being broadcast to the entire plane. Luckily, the audio was so warped by the interference that Uncle Frank just thought it was a New Age European remix. "I hate this techno crap," Frank complained, stuffing napkins into his ears. However, the large Russian man in front of him, whose tag on his briefcase read eerie, was not distracted by the music. He slowly stood up in his seat, turning around to face the boys. He was so tall his head brushed the overhead oxygen mask compartment. He looked down at Fuller's glowing, smoking backpack. "The nightlight," Yuri rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "It is smelling like the tragedy of a submarine engine. Give it to me. It's private property." Buzz squeaked, his voice jumping 3 octaves. "You can't touch a miner's backpack. I know my rights. I am having the right to not be on fire at 30,000 feet," Yuri replied. He reached a massive, calloused hand over the seat. Just as his fingers brushed the zipper of Fuller's bag, the silent nightmare gave one final, violent pop. A jet of purple spark shot out, hitting the tray table latch. The table snapped down, hitting Yuri's knuckles. "Ow! By the Tsar's beard!" Yuri roared. "It was Kevin!" Buzz yelled, pointing a trembling finger. "He's the one with the weird DVD player. He's the one Uncle Vlad sent the secret stuff to." Brenda, the flight attendant, arrived at that exact second, seeing a giant Russian man clutching his hand, a glowing backpack, and Buzz pointing at a very small, innocent-looking Kevin. "All right, that's it," Brenda snapped, pulling out a pair of plastic zip-tie restraints. "I don't care who started it. We are crossing into international airspace, and I am not losing this plane to a bunch of kids and a coat hanger." Kevin looked at the backpack, then at the silver remote in his lap. The dial was spinning on its own now. "It's not me," he pleaded. "It's the physics. The frequencies are overlapping." Page 5. Brenda snatched the smoldering, silent nightmare from Fuller's bag using a pair of metal tongs she usually used for ice. "I'll be holding this in the galley's fireproof containment bin," she said, her eyes boring into Buzz. "If I so much as hear a sneeze from this row, you'll be spending the rest of the flight in the lavatory." As Brenda marched away, Buzz's face shifted from a mask of terror to a low simmering rage. He had been humiliated in front of the entire cabin, and his precious jammer was gone. He looked at Kevin, who was still clutching the silver remote, and a devious light sparked in his eyes. "You think you're so smart, Kevin," Buzz whispered, leaning in. "You think you're the hero because you have Vlad's little magic box. But you're just a snitch. And snitches get the blue swirl dot." "What's the blue swirl?" Kevin asked, his grip tightening on the remote. "It's what happens when you accidentally fall into the airplane toilet right as it flushes," Buzz lied with a predatory grin. "I'm gonna go check the plumbing. When I come back, you better hope you haven't lost that remote, because I might just tell Mom you were the one who put the jammer in Fuller's bag to begin with." Buzz unbuckled his seatbelt and sauntered toward the back of the plane. But he wasn't going to the bathroom. He waited until Brenda was occupied with a passenger in row 30. Then he slipped into the rear galley. He grabbed a handful of tiny salt and pepper packets and a bottle of high-acid tomato juice from an unattended prep tray. Buzz's sneaky plan was simple. He was going to rig the aft lavatory door with a tomato juice gravity trap, then scream for help, lure Kevin back there, and let the red mess do the talking. He claimed Kevin was trying to sabotage the plane's sanitation system. Meanwhile, back in the seat, Kevin noticed the silver remote's dial had stopped spinning. It was now glowing a steady, pulsative gold. On the small LCD screen of the DVD player under the seat, a message appeared in English. Link established. Target acquired, the snowy reach.
Fuller,
Kevin whispered.
did you see that? I see a lot of things, Kevin,
Fuller said, his eyes wide as he stared at the ceiling.
I think the Pepsi is talking to me. It says, "The cat is coming."
Suddenly, from the back of the plane, a muffled thud followed by a high-pitched
"Hey!"
echoed through the cabin. Buzz's trap had gone off prematurely, but not on Kevin. Page 6. The thud was followed by a sound like a wet sponge being launched at a whiteboard. In his rush to frame Kevin, Buzz had forgotten one crucial rule of physics. In a pressurized cabin undergoing slight turbulence, gravity doesn't always play by the rules. He had balanced a half-open carton of tomato juice and 4 packets of salt atop the slightly ajar lavatory door. He had planned to lure Kevin back, but instead, the door was kicked open from the inside. Uncle Frank emerged, rubbing his eyes and grumbling about the
tiny, thimble-sized sinks.
The carton of juice didn't just fall. It performed a graceful arc, appended itself, and landed squarely on Frank's head.
Ack! I'm melting. The cabin pressure has burst my arteries.
Frank screamed, blinded by the thick red liquid.
Buzz!
Kate's voice pierced through the plane from 10 rows up. She had seen her eldest son hovering near the galley with a guilty
deer in the headlights
expression.
It was a localized weather event.
But shouted back, backing away as Brenda the flight attendant returned, her face now a terrifying mask of professional fury.
Mr. McAllister,
Brenda said, her voice dangerously low.
I have a pilot on the flight deck asking why the smoke-detected light for the aft lavatory just turned on because of tomato-based interference. Would you like to explain, or should I have the Russian authorities meet us at the gate with a set of very heavy handcuffs?
Buzz paled. The
silent nightmare
was one thing, but interfering with the McAllisters' access to a bathroom was a crime his father wouldn't forgive. Meanwhile, back in row 49, Kevin wasn't watching the comedy. He was staring at the silver remote. The link established message had changed. It now showed a wireframe map of a city, but not Moscow. It was a city of tiny, peaked roofs and cobblestone streets that looked like they had been drawn by a shaky hand with a fountain pen.
Kevin,
Buller whispered, his voice trembling.
The map, it's moving. It's looking for something.
Kevin watched as a red dot on the screen tracked across the map, finally stopping at a building that looked like an abandoned townhouse. At that exact moment, the plane's engines changed pitch. It wasn't the sound of a descent. It was a rhythmic mechanical purr. 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 Purr.
Do you hear that?
Kevin asked.
Hear what?
Lenny asked from across the aisle.
All I hear is Uncle Frank crying about his shirt. The cat,
Kevin whispered.
The plane sounds like a cat.
Page 7. The humming from the floorboards intensified, vibrating through the soles of Kevin's sneakers. Suddenly, the silence of the cabin, momentarily stunned by Uncle Frank's tomato juice opera, was broken by a familiar tinny sound.
Joy to the world, the Lord is come.
It was the Lincoln Park Junior Carolers. But they weren't on the plane's PA system this time. The sound was coming directly from the black DVD case under the seat.
Kevin, turn that off,
Aunt Leslie hissed, still dabbing at her blouse.
We'd had enough music for one flight. I can't.
Kevin grunted, reaching down. He pulled the case out, and his eyes nearly popped. The DVD player wasn't even turned on, yet the disc inside was spinning so fast the friction was making the plastic casing warm to the touch. The audio of the carolers began to warp and distort, just as it had in the driveway when the newspaper hit the door.
F-A-la-la-la-la. He is coming! La 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 la!
The voices shifted from the high-pitched chirps of children to a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in Kevin's very marrow. On the small LCD screen, the wireframe map of the tiny city vanished. It was replaced by a single, hand-drawn image of a huge, yellow eye with a vertical slit pupil.
Buzz! Look!
Kevin yelled. Buzz, who was currently being lectured by Brenda and trying to wipe tomato juice off his velvet sleeve, glanced over. His sneer faltered.
What did you do to that thing, Kevin? Why is it looking at me? I didn't do anything. It's the remote.
The caroler audio reached a fever pitch, sounding like a skipping record.
The cat! The cat! The cat!
Suddenly, the overhead reading lights above row 49 began to strobe in a rhythmic pattern. 3 short pulses, 3 long. It was Morse code, but before Kevin could even try to decipher it, the air in the cabin seemed to thicken. The scent of stale airplane pretzels was replaced by the smell of ancient paper, damp ink, and milk.
Does anyone else smell a dairy farm?
Uncle Frank asked, sniffing the air suspiciously. At that exact moment, the Boeing 747 gave a massive shudder. It wasn't turbulence. It felt as if a giant, invisible hand had reached out and plucked the plane from the sky. Outside the window, the clouds didn't just pass by. They began to turn into sketches. The white vapor transformed into cross-hatched lines of charcoal and ink. Page 8. The violet strobe of the reading lights cast long, jerky shadows against the cabin walls. Buzz, still standing in the aisle, gripped the headrest of row 48 so hard his knuckles turned white.
Kevin,
he stammered, his bravado finally cracking like a dry twig.
My jammer. I can hear it. It's inside your box.
It was true. A high-pitched, electronic whine, the signature sound of Buzz's
Silent Nightmare,
was bleeding out of the DVD player, harmonizing with the ghostly caroler voices. The two devices had formed an accidental bridge, a feedback loop of Chicago mischief and Russian experimental physics.
You shouldn't have messed with it, Buzz,
Kevin shouted over the rising hum.
You crossed the beams. I just wanted to mess up the movie,
Buzz wailed. Suddenly, the frantic energy in the cabin shifted. The loud, complaining voices of the McAllister clan went strangely quiet, as if someone had turned a giant volume knob down to 0. In that vacuum of sound, a new noise emerged from the rear galley, the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of something small and wooden. Kevin looked toward the back of the plane. Emerging from behind the blue curtain of the galley was a tiny, hand-drawn wooden trolley. It was no larger than a matchbox, with wheels that looked like they had been sketched in ink. Standing on the back of the trolley was a figure that made Kevin's jaw drop. It was a mouse. But it wasn't a normal mouse. It wore a tiny, navy blue conductor's cap and held a miniature brass lantern that flickered with a real, microscopic flame. The mouse looked up, its ink-dot eyes scanning the giant cabin of the 747 with a look of professional detachment.
Is that a rat?
Uncle Frank whispered, his tomato juice-stained face frozen in horror.
Leslie, there's a rat on the plane. We're in a flying sewer. It's not a rat, Frank,
Kevin said, his voice hushed with awe.
Look at the hat.
The mouse conductor pulled a tiny silver whistle from its vest and blew. The sound was surprisingly loud, a clear, piercing note that resonated through the plane's air vents. In response, a dozen more mice scrambled out from the seat pockets and the overhead bins. They weren't scurrying like pests. They were moving with purpose, carrying tiny ropes made of sewing thread and miniature ladders made of toothpicks.
They're taking over the galley,
Fuller cheered, clapping his hands.
Go, mice, go!
One mouse, wearing a pair of tiny aviator goggles, scurried up the side of Yuri's briefcase and peered at the
Silent Nightmare
device Brenda had left on a service tray. The mouse shook its head, pulled out a tiny pencil and made a note on a scroll of paper.
"Hey! Get away from my tech!"
Buzz yelled, reaching out to swat the mouse.
"Buzz, don't!"
Kevin screamed. But it was too late. As Buzz's hand descended, the mouse conductor blew his whistle again. The air around the beverage cart rippled like a reflection in a pond, and the
"Here comes the cat!"
DVD case on Kevin's lap erupted in a blinding flash of golden light. Page 9. The golden light didn't fade. It solidified into a shimmering haze that filled the aisle. The mice didn't scatter. Instead, they went to work. With the precision of a pit crew, the tiny rodents began harvesting. One group of mice used their thread ropes to lasso Uncle Frank's gold-plated wristwatch, which he had set on his tray table. With a coordinated heave, they dragged it toward a gap in the floorboards.
"Hey! That's a genuine imitation Rolex!"
Frank hollered, but as he reached for it, a mouse in a tiny hard hat pointed a miniature red laser pointer at his hand, causing him to recoil in confusion. Buzz, however, wasn't about to let a cartoon rat upstage him. He lunged for the mouse conductor, his large hand closing around the tiny wooden trolley.
"I gotcha, you little..."
Snap. The mouse conductor didn't bite. He didn't even flinch. He simply tapped the floor of the trolley with his lantern. A tiny, spring-loaded wooden arm, built into the sketch-like vehicle, swung out and delivered a perfectly timed, mousetrap flick to Buzz's thumb.
"Youch!"
Buzz screamed, leaping back and sticking his thumb into his mouth.
"The drawing bit me! It's made of wood, but it's sharp! It's not just a drawing, Buzz,"
Kevin realized, leaning over the edge of his seat.
"The Silent Nightmare opened a door, and Uncle Vlad's DVD is acting like a bridge. They're from Mouseville."
The mice were now swarming the
Silent Nightmare
device. Using tiny crowbars, they began dismantling Buzz's jammer with impossible speed. They weren't breaking it, they were repurposing it. They took the copper wiring and wrapped it around their trolley's axles. They took the glowing LED and mounted it to the front of a miniature cargo sled.
"They're building something,"
Kevin whispered. Suddenly, the distorted audio of the carolers changed again. The
F-A-la-la
melody was replaced by a rhythmic, mechanical chanting. It sounded like hundreds of tiny voices singing in a language that was half squeak, half Russian.
"Koshka, Koshka, Koshka. What does Koshka mean?"
Kevin asked, looking at Yuri. Yuri's face was ashen, his previous anger replaced by a deep, ancestral dread. He crossed himself with a trembling hand.
"It means the cat."
As he spoke, the cabin pressure dropped with a sudden whoosh. The oxygen masks didn't drop, but something else did. From the overhead compartment above the galley, a long, orange, furry tail, thick as a fire hose and sketched with jagged charcoal lines, slithered down and began to wrap itself around the beverage cart. Page 10. The giant, charcoal-sketched tail twitched, its orange fur shimmering with the same violet static as Buzz's ruined jammer. It tightened its grip on the beverage cart, the metal groaning under the pressure. The mice worked with frantic, blurred movements, finishing their modifications on the trolley just as a low, rumbling purr shook the entire fuselage of the 747.
"It's too big,"
Kevin yelled, holding the silver remote out like a cross.
"It's not going to fit in the aisle."
But the mice weren't afraid. The conductor mouse stood atop his newly copper-wired trolley and pointed his lantern directly at the
"Here comes the cat"
DVD case on Kevin's lap. The disc inside accelerated to a high-pitched scream. Suddenly, the golden light from the DVD player turned into a powerful vacuum. One by one, the mice began to leap. They didn't fall. They soared through the air, their tiny bodies turning into streaks of ink as they were sucked into the spinning center of the disc. The miniature trolleys, the thread ropes, and even the harvested salt packets followed, disappearing into the black plastic casing like water down a drain. The orange tail gave one final, violent lash, knocking a stack of napkins into the air, before it, too, began to dematerialize. The jagged charcoal lines dissolved into fine black dust that was pulled into the DVD player's tray. Snap! The DVD tray clicked shut on its own. The violet strobe lights vanished. The silent nightmare humming died. The distorted caroler music cut off mid-note. Suddenly, the Boeing 747 felt steady again. The smell of milk and ancient ink evaporated, replaced by the familiar, dusty scent of airplane air. The clouds outside the window returned to their natural, fluffy white state, no longer looking like charcoal sketches. Silence fell over the cabin, a heavy, ringing silence that felt more deafening than the chaos. Uncle Frank stood frozen in the aisle, a single napkin stuck to his tomato juice-stained forehead. Buzz was still clutching his flicked thumb, his mouth hanging open. The entire McAllister family, and every other passenger on Flight 422, sat perfectly still, blinking as if they had all just woken up from the same vivid, terrifying dream. Kevin looked down at his lap. The DVD player was cold. The silver remote screen was blank. There was no sign of a mouse, a trolley, or a giant orange tail.
Did
Buzz started, his voice cracking.
Did everyone just see the giant orange tail, or am I having a reaction to the jalapeno peanuts?
Uncle Frank slowly wiped the juice from his eyes and looked at his bare wrist.
My watch,
he whispered.
The rats took my Rolex.
Page 11. The silence was broken by the sharp clack-clack-clack of heels. Brenda, the flight attendant, emerged from the forward cabin, smoothing her apron. She stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes sweeping over the scene, Uncle Frank dripping in red, but shaking like a leaf, and the entire row of McAllisters staring into space as if they'd seen a ghost.
All right,
Brenda said, her voice wary.
The pilots say the electrical anomaly has cleared. Why is everyone so quiet? And Mr. McAllister, why are you wearing a napkin as a hat?
Frank didn't answer. He just pointed a trembling finger at the floor where the mice had been.
The engineering team. They were 4 inches tall. They took my watch, Brenda. They had a lantern.
Brenda sighed, a long, weary sound that suggested she was going to need a very long vacation after this.
Sir, if you're trying to file an insurance claim for a mouse robbery at 30,000 feet, you're going to need a better story than that. Now, everyone, please sit down. We are beginning our initial descent into Moscow.
As the cabin erupted into a low murmur of confused whispers, and the frantic rustle of people checking their luggage for missing items, Kevin slowly opened the DVD player. His heart skipped a beat. The disc, the one that had previously featured a hand-drawn orange cat pulling a cart, had changed. The drawing was gone. In its place, the surface of the disc was now a deep, shimmering violet, etched with thousands of tiny, microscopic lines that looked like a circuit board. And there, right in the center, was a tiny, unmistakable golden paw print.
Kevin,
Buzz whispered, leaning over. He looked humbled, his face pale and his sneaky energy completely drained.
That thing, it's a portal, isn't it? Vlad didn't send a movie. He sent a doorway. I think the silent nightmare was the key, Buzz,
Kevin said, his voice low.
Your jammer's frequency must have unlocked whatever was on this disc. We didn't just see a drawing. We brought it here. Well, unbring it.
Buzz hissed.
If those things follow us to the dacha, I'm sleeping in the van. I'm not getting slapped by a wooden trolley in my sleep again.
Kevin looked back at the blank screen of the remote. Suddenly, a single line of text flickered into existence, glowing with a soft, ominous green light.
Cargo secured. Welcome to the Reach. Beware the shadow of the Kashka.
Outside the window, the clouds parted. Below them, the vast, snowy expanse of the Russian wilderness stretched out like a white sheet, dotted with the distant, amber lights of Moscow. It looked beautiful, but to Kevin, it looked like a giant, frozen chessboard.
"Kevin! Pack that away!"
Kate called out, leaning over the seats.
"We're landing. And please, for the love of Christmas, tell me you haven't lost your passport."
Kevin patted his pocket. He had his passport. But he also had the catalyst, vial, the shimmering disc, and the feeling that the wet bandits were the least of his problems. Page 12. The landing was a bone-jarring thud that sent Uncle Frank's remaining tomato juice flying onto the back of a stranger's head. As the Boeing 747 taxied through the swirling Moscow snow, Kevin watched the Russian ground crews in their heavy Ushankas. They looked like gray ghosts against the white tarmac. The McAllister clan moved through the airport like a panicked herd of caribou. After a harrowing ride in two cramped, rattling vans, they finally arrived at their destination, a rented Soviet-era suburban manor on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't a cozy dacha, it was a sprawling, four-story fortress of stone and dark timber. The windows were narrow and deep-set, and the architecture felt heavy, as if the house itself were trying to sink into the frozen earth.
"It's huge,"
Fuller chirped, hopping out of the van.
"It looks like a haunted library."
"It's Uncle Vlad's old place," Peter explained, struggling with a frozen lock.
"He said it had character. I think he meant drafts."
While the rest of the family fought over the bedrooms on the lower floors, Kevin felt a strange pull, a rhythmic thrumming in his heels that matched the vibration of the silver remote. He bypassed the kitchens and the grand parlor, heading straight for the narrow, winding staircase at the back of the house. The fourth-floor attic was freezing, the air thick with the smell of ozone and ancient paper. In the center of the room stood an archway made of a material that looked like obsidian, bolted into the floorboards with iron rivets that seemed fused to the wood. It was another portal, but this one felt permanent, solid, and completely indestructible. Resting in a glass-topped pedestal at the center of the arch was a disc case. Kevin approached it slowly, his breath hitching in the cold air. The label read, "Here Comes the Cat. 1992 Master Edition, Archival Build, 1989 Architectures." This wasn't like the plastic disc on the plane. This one was made of a shimmering, dark alloy that seemed to swallow the light. Kevin realized then that the house hadn't been rented by accident. This was the laboratory of Uncle Vlad, and the 1992 disc, the one that could never be destroyed, was the anchor for everything. He looked at the silver remote in his hand. The screen flickered to life one last time before the battery died, displaying a final, chilling message. "Stationary portal detected. The reach is open. Beware the master." Kevin looked up at the indestructible arch. He was miles from home. His family was downstairs complaining about the lack of American cable, and he was standing in front of a gateway to a world of ink, mice, and a cat that was no longer a drawing.